Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martina Pluda. I am a law and economics graduate from the Paris University of Salzburg, and I specialize in animal law from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. I am currently working as a jurist, researcher, and jurist in the field of animal law, amongst others. Today, I would like to give you an overview on the state of the art of the EU legislation on animals and animal welfare. But first of all, let me tell you that it is a great pleasure for me to address this audience of key actors and experts in the field of animal welfare. So thank you. This is the agenda for the talk, but I suggest we deep dive right into it. I would like to start with one key concept in order to understand the functioning of the European Union and its legislation in practice. The enforcement of animal welfare legislation falls within the principle of subsidiarity. This means that member states are responsible for the day-to-day enforcement through their national legislation and control activities, and for the transposition of directives into national legislation, and finally for the implementation of EU rules at national level. On the other hand, the European Commission is responsible for providing appropriate information and, when necessary, training on EU legislative requirements. It is also responsible for ensuring that EU legislation is properly implemented and enforced by the member states. And finally, it is responsible for taking action against member states that have failed to implement legal requirements. The EU areas of competence regarding animals are the following. So, farm animals and experimentation animals. Wild animals are covered only partially, and we will see why later on in the presentation. Whilst, on the other hand, companion animals are not subject to the animal welfare legislation of the European Union. Before covering the existing legislation, I want to mention the key principle of animal welfare in the European Union. In 2009, the Lisbon Treaty came into force, and it amended the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, finally introducing an important new principle, which is the recognition that animals are sentient beings. As a matter of fact, Article 13 states that member states shall pay full regard to the welfare of animals since they are sentient beings when developing and implementing their policies. Let's move to our first topic, to the first area, which is the one regarding farm animals. We must say that with the support and cooperation of the member states, the European Commission has been promoting animal welfare actually for over 40 years, gradually improving the lives of farm animals. The first step was actually taken in 1974 with the first EU legislation of the protection of animals in slaughterhouses. From then onwards, harmonized EU rules have been covering a wide range of animal categories and species, as well as welfare affecting issues, such as the directive on the protection of all farm animals, of laying hens, of chickens for meat production, of calves, of pigs, and the regulations on the protection of animals during transport and related operation, and of animals at the time of killing. We will now go a bit into detail in all of these regulations and directives, as much as the time allows us, of course. So an important step in 1998 was the previously mentioned Council Directive on the Protection of Animals Kept for Farming Purposes, which gave general rules for the protection of vertebrate animals of all species kept for the production of food, wool, skin, or fur, and for other farming purposes, including fish, reptiles, and amphibians. These rules reflect the so-called 5 freedoms, which are, as listed, the freedom from hunger and thirst, from discomfort, from pain, injury, and disease, to express normal behavior, and from fear and distress. Moving on, laying hens and broilers are covered by 2 different directives. The first one, which is the one regarding laying hens, brought a major novelty, as it made for the first time a distinction between 3 types of rearing systems for laying hens. The first one is a system of the non-enriched cages, which have been prohibited since the 1st of January 2012. And there is a system with the enriched cages and alternative systems. The directive also states that all egg productions Units must be registered with the competent authorities in member states and have a distinguishing number which can be used to trace eggs back to their farm of origin and production method. Here is a small overview. And consider that this is the only EU-wide system of compulsory labeling on animal welfare. Such a classification does not exist for any other type of animal product yet. Then there is a council directive which regulates the protection of broilers and aims to reduce the overcrowding of chickens by setting a maximum stocking density and ensure better animal welfare by specifying requirements such as lighting, litter, feeding, and ventilation. This was actually the first time that welfare indicators were included in animal welfare legislation as a means of scientific assessment. We will now move on to cows and a small parenthesis on cattle. This directive prohibits the use of confined individual pens after the age of 8 weeks for calves and sets out the minimum dimensions for individual pens and for calves kept in groups. Calves are not to be tethered except under very specific circumstances stated in the directive and must be fed according to their physiological needs. In particular, their food must contain sufficient iron and a minimum daily ration and fiber food must be provided. Please note that there is no specific EU legislation concerning cattle, but the general rules of the directive on the protection of animals kept for farming purposes apply. As to pigs, their welfare is assured by this directive that lays down the minimum standards for improving the quality of flooring surfaces, for increasing the living space available, for introducing higher levels of training and competence on welfare issues for personnel handling pigs, for setting requirements for light and maximum noise levels. It also provides permanent access to fresh water and materials for rooting, playing, and fulfilling the behavior needs of pigs as they are very social animals. And finally, for setting a minimum rearing age of 4 weeks. We must also underline that in particular from the 1st of January 2013, pregnant sows must be kept in groups instead of individual stalls during part of their pregnancy, as it lowers their level of stress during this period. We will now move over to the regulation on transport. We must absolutely mention some data. Around 4 million cattle, 28 million pigs, 4 million sheep, 243 million poultry, and 150,000 horses are transported for more than 8 hours within the EU every year. It is therefore essential that this is done with the utmost care and attention and with solid legislation. Therefore, the objective of the regulation is to define the responsibilities of all parties involved in the transportation chain by setting the requirements for the transport of live vertebrate animals within the Union, including the specific checks to be carried out by officials on consignments entering or leaving the customs territory of the Union. Authorities must also carry out non-discriminatory inspections of animals, means of transport, and accompanying documents to verify that the requirements of the regulation have been complied with. To this regard, annual reports must be submitted to the Commission, accompanied by an analysis of the major deficiencies. In general, we can say that this regulation offers more efficient monitoring tools and stricter rules on journeys exceeding 8 hours, on the duration and resting periods, on authorization of all transporters and certificate of competence for drivers, on the fitness for transport of animals, means of transport, and transport practices such as loading and unloading and handling of animals. We will now move to slaughter. The EU legislation to protect animals at the time of killing already existed, but was outdated in many aspects. Now the new regulation brought several major changes in order to minimize the pain and suffering of animals through the use of properly approved stunning methods. These provisions apply to farm animals and not to animals killed under other circumstances like hunting, bullfighting, stray dogs and cats in shelters, or animals in the wild, and so forth. The slaughter and killing outside slaughterhouses is restricted to a very limited number of circumstances, such as disease control, fur animals, and hatchery waste. Furthermore, slaughterhouses must be built and equipped in respect of these rules, as, for example, meat intended for human consumption must originate from approved slaughterhouses, and staff employed for slaughtering must possess the necessary professional knowledge. As a general rule, animals must be stunned before slaughter or killed immediately, but member states retain the right to authorize religious slaughter without pre-stunning in their own territory. One last point worth mentioning is that the regulation also requires slaughterhouses in third countries exporting meat to the European Union to comply with similar standards to those in the regulation. We will now move on to experimental animals. This area is regulated by this directive on animals used for scientific purposes. The aim of the directive is to strengthen legislation and improve the welfare of animals used in laboratory tests, as well as to firmly anchor the principle of the 3 Rs: replacement, reduction, refinement, replacement of live animals to alternative non-animal systems, the reduction to the fewest number of animals possible, and the refinement of new procedures that limit the potential of discomfort for the animals. Please note that animal testing for finished cosmetic products was banned in 2004 and for cosmetic ingredients in March 2009. And then finally, since March 2013, no cosmetic tests tested on animals can be marketed in the EU. Regarding wild animals, as we said previously, they are partially covered by EU legislations only by the following provisions. First of all, the so-called Zoo Directive on the keeping of wild animals in zoos, safari parks, aquarium, botanical gardens, and orangeries. Additionally to the provisions in the directive, all permanent exhibitions of animals and plants have to comply with wildlife trade regulations, as well as with nature conservation, animal welfare, animal transport, veterinary, phytosanitary, and customs law. We also have the so-called Birds Directive on the conservation of wild birds, and the Habitats Directive on the conservation of habitats and wild fauna and flora. Last but not least, we come to companion animals. Here the only rules regarding pets, which this category comprises dogs, cats, and parrots only, are the ones of the regulation on the non-commercial movement of pet animals applied to the cross-border movement of pets into member states. This regulation does not apply to the movement of such animals within one member state. And here the regulation limits the number of pets that may be moved for non-commercial purposes to 5. Just one side aspect of pet animals is the ban on cat and dog fur that was introduced with a regulation. So here I conclude. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope this overview on the EU legislation was helpful for you and your work as veterinarians in the field of animal welfare. Thank you.